Jurassic World Rebirth is less than a month away. It is also Jurassic June. To celebrate both of these things, I've decided to go back to all of the previous films in this franchise and look at the many creatures that are presented on screen. I want to talk about their designs, how they held up then, and how they hold up now. We already did the first movie, so now let's talk about its underrated successor, The Lost World Jurassic Park. Yeah, I quite like this movie. I think this movie's incredibly underrated. Like it always ranks low on people's ranking of the franchise, and I really like it. It's like my second favorite film in the whole franchise. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Starting off with the Compsognathus that shows up at the very beginning of the film, when of course a rich family, they end up on the island, and some compies are like, yeah, food. Anyway, I really like their movements here. There's a lot of emphasis on their bird-like nature, which is something that, is fair because there is a very clear link between birds and dinosaurs. I mean, obviously now we know that birds are actually dinosaurs, but back then there was even a lot of talk for how close birds truly are to dinosaurs. So I love seeing it represented in a dinosaur like Compsognathus that's very small and bird-like in nature. It has like an arrowhead-shaped snout, a slender build, it's overall very thin, and of course it's presented as naked. Now, there is a lot of discussion on whether or not Compsognathus did have feathers. Its close relative, Sinosauropteryx, did have them, but currently we don't have any evidence for Compsognathus. However, you will see a lot of artists depict them with feathers. Feathers are probably pretty likely for a dinosaur like this. This is probably decently accurate for the time, but of course it just doesn't hold up to our current understanding of these sorts of animals. However, I do like the fact that they are presented with lips, which same with the velociraptors. It's interesting that some creatures have them and some don't. But that is a very good start to the list. Next up is the herd of Stegosaurus. These look awesome. There's so many awesome things about them. Their immense scale, the quality of the CGI, there's a lot of really good things about them. They are oversized by quite a bit. Like, these guys are quite huge, and there are some things about their anatomy that don't really hold up to our current understanding of the animal, like probably how huge their hips are or the placement of their head, as the attachment point for the vertebrae kind of attached to the back of the skull instead of being underneath the skull. But that aside, these are really good portrayal. They have their osteoderms, which are those plates on their back. They have the thagomizer, which are those two sets of spikes that they have on the end of their tail, and they actually hold their tails up in more so a correct position, with the end of the tail starting to slope down a little bit because, of course, that thagomizer, that collection of spikes, are pretty heavy, so they would kind of weigh the tail down a little bit. They just look awesome, and they have a very cool scene in the overall movie. There's also a baby Stegosaurus that has reduced proportions, smaller plates, and of course a stubbier face and things like that. The animatronic that they used for the baby Stegosaurus looks really good, and all things considered, all of this just looks awesome. A very cool and intense scene, and it's always really good to see herbivorous dinosaurs utilized in a way that isn't peaceful. That's something that happens a lot, where you have herbivorous dinosaurs and the characters are approaching it with the idea that oh, they won't eat me, so they are safe, when in reality, of course, herbivores, a lot of times you have to be more careful around herbivores than you do predatory animals, because herbivores are often pretty aggressive animals. And I like seeing that these stegosaurs are aggressive animals, especially when you're messing with one of their young. I think that's a very nice touch. After that, we have the Pachycephalosaurus, which actually doesn't look too far off from our modern understanding of the animal. I mean, the whole proportions of it seem to be pretty spot on. The shape of its skull seems to be there. It does have a beak too, and they actually portrayed it with cheeks, which there's a little bit of a debate on whether or not Pachycephalosaurus had cheeks. A lot of dinosaurs, there's a lot of agreement that they did, like hadrosaurs and things like that, but it's still not entirely agreed upon if dinosaurs like Pachycephalosaurus had them. I mean, in Prehistoric Planet, we see them portrayed without cheeks, which is, certainly an interesting portrayal. But it does have all of these little bumps all across its head and on its nasal portion, so it seems like a fairly solid depiction of Pachycephalosaurus, and I like the way that it's utilized. I like how it's another dinosaur that you kind of have to be a little bit careful around, despite the fact that it's a mostly herbivorous dinosaur. There is also some talk that Pachycephalosaurus was an omnivorous dinosaur due to the shape of some of its teeth, but that's of course not entirely known right now. But still, it's very cool to see Pachycephalosaurus portrayed in such a way. That whole stampede scene in general, just really good, really top-notch stuff, and we're going to be talking about a few creatures in that scene. So yeah, we'll just stay on that topic with the Gallimimus. Now, we already talked about the Gallimimus quite a bit in the first movie breakdown, and there's not much else I can say right here. It lacks its feathers. It has this really interesting sort of orange coloration, but the whole anatomy and the whole shape of it seems to match up pretty well. Yeah, there's really not much else I can add to it. It shows up briefly in a couple of scenes. But then there is the Parasaurolophus. Now, this is actually our best look that we get at Parasaurolophus in this franchise thus far, and it looks pretty dang good, especially for the time. This is a pretty accurate portrayal of Parasaurolophus for the time. I mentioned in the previous video, when we were talking about Parasaurolophus in there, that for the most part, hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus were portrayed as relatively thin, especially in the neck. We now know, nowadays, that hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus had pretty beefy necks and just a pretty beefy build overall. They were these hefty herbivores that would have been a true sight for sore eyes. Aside from that, it does have a lot of things that you would expect from a Parasaurolophus portrayal. Like, you'll notice that it seems to have some tall neural spines that run down its back. That is something that hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus did have, and because it's a little bit shrink-wrapped right here, you can really notice them. It does have its crest, something that Parasaurolophus is quite known for. It has a beak, it's portrayed with cheeks as well, and of course it's probably able to switch from a bipedal to a quadrupedal stance, especially going off of the first film, and it gets down pretty low in this film. It's also huge. It's portrayed as being huge, which is pretty true because hadrosaurs, again, they were these hefty, huge animals, at least a huge portion of them were. And Parasaurolophus was no exception. It was a big dinosaur. I also really like its sounds. They kind of sound like these loud trumpeting noises, which does have some basis in accuracy because Parasaurolophus is one of the few dinosaurs that we have a good idea to what it sounded like when it was alive. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but a team of scientists did recreate a Parasaurolophus head. And I mentioned in the last video that the crest is actually hollow and it links up with the nasal cavity, which implies that they would be able to blow air through there to produce these loud noises. A team of researchers recreated this whole structure right here, and they sent air through it to produce a noise, and it was this loud trumpeting noise that kind of sounded like a ship horn. Now, obviously, that's probably not a perfect system, but that's really as close as we can get to any dinosaur vocalization, or at least extinct dinosaur. Like, we know what birds sound like, of course, because they're the ones that live today, we know what they sound like. And this isn't really too far off from that. It does sound like the type of trumpeting, honking noises that you would probably expect from Parasaurolophus, so they're kind of ahead of their time right here. It's a very nice portrayal, and I love the quality of the CGI, and I love how difficult it was for everybody to try to take it down. Herbivores ain't no pushovers. You heard? I heard. After that is Mamenchisaurus, our second sauropod in the franchise overall. I like how it's distinct from Brachiosaurus. It has a thinner neck, a smaller head, and a longer tail and things like that. It's a pretty decent portrayal for, how quickly it shows, like it comes and goes. It is probably a little bit thin compared to the way that the real life animal would have been, but it's still a very fun portrayal, and I do love when they introduce some lesser known dinosaurs to the screen, even if it is very brief. Then we have Triceratops, one of the many dinosaurs to break out of the little camp that they had set up. A lot of the same things apply to this one that we already saw in the first Jurassic Park. The shape of the frill seems consistent, and its overall body shape seems to be relatively consistent. I will say that it does seem like its tail is relatively short here, which is in huge, stark contrast to the way that it's portrayed in Jurassic World and in a lot of the games. So, in a way, I think this one's a little bit more accurate than those ones. Still not a big fan of the way that the face looks or the frill, but it is still a pretty decent portrayal. And again, it's nice to see some herbivores doing something more than just being peaceful carnivore meat. I haven't realized until I'm doing this list how many times that happens in Lost World. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I like this movie so much. They portray the herbivores, they feel like actual animals more so than, something to be stared at for, to show that, oh, dinosaurs are so cool creatures, and then just get killed by a carnivore. That's pretty cool. I quite like that. We also get a brief look at a baby Triceratops, and it looks consistent to the ones that we're about to get in Jurassic World Evolution. So yeah. You got these stubbier proportions with smaller and reduced horns. Not overall too accurate, but still it's pretty close to what baby Triceratops was like in the wild. Then we're getting into Tyrannosaurus Rex territory. So there's the buck, the doe, and junior. We'll start off with the buck. The buck is probably one of my favorite T-Rexes in the whole franchise, and that mainly stems from his design. He has this really cool green coloration with pronounced eyebrow ridges and a more pronounced nasal ridge. It's very cool and subtle details that I just absolutely appreciate, and it all just looks really cool, especially with the striping that he has. The doe is a little bit more reminiscent to the way the Rexy was, with more so a brown coloration mixed in with some other colors too, which is also something that I love because that was some consistency that they were having. It felt like with these earlier movies, they were trying to have like put some sense behind some of the portrayals that they had. Like, yeah, the females, they're a little bit more brown in coloration, whereas the males, they are a little bit more green in coloration. And Junior, he sports that sort of green coloration that his father has, which implies that he would grow into that. I liked that consistency that they had with it. And nowadays they don't do that too much. There's a lot more like for example, in Camp Cretaceous, we got Big Edie, who is a female T-Rex, and she's blue, which is very different from the way that Rexy and the doe were. Which of course that was probably produced by a different company, and they probably did their own thing to it. But I liked the implication that this is how these animals would have been in the wild. And it really it got you thinking. It's like, there's a little bit more layers to these animals and they have their own social structures. That's something that I really appreciated about those earlier movies. And it's something we got a little bit more of as like especially into the third film. In the third film, there's quite a bit of sexual dimorphism. And so, we'll talk about that more when we get into that. But it's something that I thought was really cool. But yeah, the T-Rex family, they're really cool. They're really cool. Their animatronics are amazing. Their CGI models are amazing. Junior, his whole practical effect is awesome as well. And I like how he looks like a juvenile baby T-Rex in this universe, of course. Very distinct from how we would likely expect T-Rex to look nowadays, with a more slender snout and things like that. He's got more so like a blocky snout compared to his parents, which again, that makes sense in universe. Just very well done across the board with those. And again, I really like the implication that there's a lot of sexual dimorphism going on with these fellas. Then after that, we have the velociraptors. Now they've stepped away from the sort of brown coloration that we saw in the first film, and they gave them tiger stripes, which is very cool. Like, they look awesome. We don't get to see it too well because it's in the darkness for the most part, but especially some of the close-up shots that you can see, it's very pleasing for the eye. You got some nice orange coloration with counter shading of white and some black striping. It looks great. There's also a little bit of sexual dimorphism that happens with them. Like, there's slight differences in the colors between the males and females, but nothing as dramatic as in Jurassic Park 3, which again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to that one. They still look great though. Pretty much everything I've said about the first one applies to this, and the fact that they're mostly Deinonychus. Well, actually, they are Deinonychus, technically speaking. Just, a little bit stylized in a few different ways, and they are fairly accurate for the time. Just a little bit less accurate the further we get into the 90s and getting into the 2000s. They still look great though, and I really like the tall grass scene. Of course, I made a whole video ranking the tall, like how each Jurassic film used the tall grass, and of course, this scene was number one. It's a fantastic scene, and the portrayals of the raptors are also really good. And then finally, we have our first appearance of a flying reptile, if you exclude birds, because birds are flying reptiles, but our first non-dinosaur flying reptile, the pterosaur, the pteranodon that we see at the very end of the film, where it lands on a branch, screeches, and then the screen fades to black. It's the final creature that we see in the movie, and it was a pretty cool addition. And I like its design here. I love the way that it's sort of silhouetted against the sunlight. Makes it seem a lot more detailed, especially with the light shining through the membrane of its wings and everything. It's a fairly thin design, and of course it does lack things like pycnofibers, or feathers, those are basically feathers, but whatever, fight me on it. But they still look it still looks really good, and it still very much looks for its time. This is likely Pteranodon longiceps, which is one of the two species that we know of, because its crest doesn't nearly seem as broad as on Pteranodon sternbergi. But just a fantastic portrayal, and it would have been cool to see more of it, but it's completely fine that we didn't. It's a very nice final shot that certainly does stick with you after you watch the movie. And there we have it, folks. Those are the creatures of the second Jurassic Park film. Awesome stuff. I love the second film. I always have so much fun with it. I love the San Diego segment where the buck gets taken to San Diego. I love everything to do with the island. I love the way that the animals were portrayed in this film. There's a lot of really good stuff about this film, and this is one of those films that people kind of just don't look at too favorably. Like, I always hear people say, like, the only good Jurassic Park film is the first one, the rest are terrible. And I disagree, because the second one is fantastic as well. It's not my favorite. Of course, the first one is my favorite, but the second one is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's a great film. It has great dinosaur portrayals, and there's not really a lot to dislike about it. Well, of course, I know that some people aren't a big fan of the characters, and there were some moments that were a little bit goofy, but I like this film. Fantastic film. Just great dinosaurs, great film in general. And it's always fun to have an emphasis on Ian Malcolm. That's always a fun character to follow. But be sure to let me know what you guys think of that film in the comments down below. And if you enjoy dinosaur-related content, please consider subscribing. I'm going to be doing more of this stuff over the course of June. I'm going to try to get every single film done before Rebirth comes out. We'll see how successful I am with that, but yeah, well, that's what we're trying to do. So be sure to stick around if you're interested in that. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Have an awesome day.